I'm Tom Clarke, and I'm delighted to be your host for this evening's Royal Academy of Engineering's Engineering Review of the Year, as we ask a group of engineering experts their perspective on some of the highs and lows of 2022. This year began, of course, with the Omicron variant of COVID-19 continuing to spread across the UK and worldwide. Then news broke of the war in Ukraine, which has tragically impacted so many lives and has also led to global concerns about energy security and rapidly rising energy prices. A return to fossil fuels to cope with this energy crisis sparked outcry following April's report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which declared it was now or never to limit global warming. And shortly after that, we saw record-breaking heat waves across Europe, including here in the UK, with temperatures above 40 degrees in England. Even as delegates gathered in Egypt last month for the UN Climate Change Conference COP27, people in Pakistan were still suffering the effects of unprecedented flooding that has submerged half the country's farmland since June. In September, we were all deeply saddened at the death of Queen Elizabeth II, a champion of engineering and innovation with the world's leading engineering award, the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering, named in Her late Majesty's honour. Engineering has enabled some awe-inspiring space exploration this year. In July, NASA's James Webb Space Telescope presented unprecedented images of far-flung galaxies, and in September, the DART mission demonstrated that we could successfully alter the course of an asteroid. A big sigh of relief there, of course. And Cornwall even has its own space programme now, or should do if things go according to plan in the coming weeks. All of which gives us plenty of material to reflect on, and I look forward to hearing engineering perspectives on all these stories and themes from our panel in just a moment. We'll also, though, be taking your questions. So to submit a question to our panel, please do this via the Slido link that's displayed on the screen. And you can also find this link in the YouTube description if you're watching on YouTube. You can submit questions throughout this evening's discussion, and we will pose as many as we have time for to our panel. So send those questions in. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel. I don't know where to start. Steve, let's start with you. Steve Holliday, Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and former Chief Executive of National Grid. He's currently Chairman of City Fibre, Chairman of Zenobi, and recently finished serving as the President of the Energy Institute. So thanks for joining us, Steve. Furthest away from me, Rachel Skinner, also a Fellow of the Academy, is an Executive Director at WSP, Patron of Women in Transport, and Chair of the Infrastructure Carbon Workstream of the Infrastructure Client Group at the Institution of Civil Engineers. I'm glad I had that written down. Welcome, Rachel, and thanks very much. Next to her, Dr. Alice Bunn, Chief Executive of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and prior to that, she was International Director at the UK Space Agency. And last but no means least, next to me, Dr. Hayaatun Sillem is Chief Executive of both the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. Thank you all for joining us. Let's just kick off then with diving straight in. Each of you in turn then, what's your highlight, the biggest story from 2022 from an engineering perspective? Should we start with you, Alice?
Thank you. Wow, biggest story, lots to choose from. I'm going to go with not only biggest, but boldest, most audacious, space-based solar power. Now, I'm just going to call it out because Steve was, gently giggling at me earlier, and I recognise that this is one of those technologies that is a little further down the line, but holds an enormous potential. So it's worth envisaging just for a minute what this looks like, right? This looks like a massive solar panel, effectively 2 kilometres wide, in geostationary orbit, so that means it can always be in the line of sun, so a real baseload energy provider. Converts that solar power to a collimated microwave beam. That's received by a big ground station, receiving station, and fed directly onto the grid. And I am also told it's not a death ray. And I've never asked if it is a death ray, but everyone's thinking it, right? So there's a real excitement there now. So we're not at the cutting metal stage, we're not at the launch stage, but this year has seen 70 space and energy companies come together. We've seen the establishment of the Space Solar Limited as the formal entity. There's a £6 million national programme doing some of the early R&D into that capability. And, if we put it off just to scale this, each one of those satellites could contribute about 1% of your average power needs in the UK. It's feasible to think we might get 15 of them. So that starts to sound quite exciting, I think.
Great. Well, maybe we'll hear a bit more about that later. Steve, let's go to you next. What's your top pick for 2022?
Way simpler than that, actually. I have to say. But I was thinking about this, and I mean, there's a project that I was involved in when I was still at National Grid, which is the interconnector between the UK and Norway, which has come into its own, of course, in the course of the last 12 months with our. And it was always a great project. It was a great project. It was going to link a hydro system in Norway with essentially our wind in the UK. When the wind's blowing, you often don't get any water in the hydro. So it's always going to be a two-way flow as well. So big security supply opportunity, and it's just, from an engineering perspective, was just to me always a really nice big engineering project. It's the biggest interconnector in the world in terms of length, 720 kilometres. It won the prize for Sustainability Project of the Year by the World Academy last year, actually. 1,400 megawatts can flow in either direction. The subsea challenge was enormous. In Norway, it goes up a fjord, and then they had to blast a 2-kilometre tunnel through the side of a mountain. So lots of great civil engineering as well, lots of electrical engineering. Just a fabulous project, and such a piece of today's energy system, if I may, as opposed to some of the dreaming stuff. So I just love that project. It was great to see it operating so well this year.
Fantastic. Often people say these sorts of big civil engineering projects don't get the attention from the news that they deserve, but I can with some pride say that we did cover that on Sky News this year. My colleague Thomas Moore did a piece on it. Rachel, how about you next?
So I'm going to go in a different direction, and maybe slightly cheat, because I'm going to go with a sort of a thin layer, dispersed, like everywhere type change that I've really seen happening this year. So for me, the sort of engineering stories of the year all relate to the fact that the climate crisis, the need to work towards decarbonisation and net zero in the round across all of our sectors, through all stages of all of our life cycles, across everything we all do as engineers. It just feels like it has landed and it has stuck, despite all those massive challenges that you were outlining at the beginning, Tom. And I think we can look and we can see that across all of our cities, where people are getting to grips with what does this challenge really mean? What do these goals that we've set, this ambition in terms of net zero, what on earth does that mean? How fast have we really got to go? And that's getting quite scary. We can look into the big corporates, the ESG activity that's going on, the fact that's getting more regulated, the fact that suddenly you can't just say what you like. You've actually got to make sure it's auditable as of next year, which is, making a few people stop and think. And of course, we can see it across all of our projects. You can see the thinking coming through. It's not just about the usual things around, the scope, the program, the cost, and so on. The carbon piece is also beginning to come through. So for me, that's the story of the year, is the fact that despite all of that sort of noise, if you like, we've managed to get that there. And of course, I guess the other one that I just need to highlight really, really quickly, just from literally the last few days, is the fact that the Earthshot Prize, one of the not plus side of things, is obviously also really exciting in the same sort of broad sustainability space. The fact that we've got potentially, a UK-based company able to really come up with some significant alternatives to mainstream plastic use is also super exciting in that broad space as well.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Hayaatun.
Great, yes, thank you. And I should just point out, Nopla is one of our Enterprise Hub members, so we were extra excited about that. I'm going to continue Rachel's theme of cheating, and I'm going to try and smuggle in 2 if I talk very quickly. So first of all, I want to revisit something I spoke about at this event last year, which is AlphaFold, which is this extraordinary AI platform developed by very clever engineers at DeepMind, which has radically improved our ability to predict the structures, the 3D structures of proteins when they're folded. And this has been one of the wicked problems of bioscience for decades. So that was an extraordinary step forward. But then those engineers at DeepMind have gone and blown my mind fully now by having, over the past year, solved, in the sense that they have predicted the structure of 200 million proteins, which actually, totally extraordinarily, represents pretty much all the proteins that are known to science. Yep. And they have then released those structures to the research community as a kind of gift. And I think that is absolutely tremendous. So I realise that for those people that are not aficionados of protein folding, this might seem a bit esoteric. Steve might be giving me kind of looks askance. But actually, proteins are the workhorses of the cell. And so this is a really transformational development that we should all be excited by. It could really unlock all sorts of potential benefits in healthcare and life sciences research. And also, I think it represents a really important example of a true use case for AI. And it shows how AI can transform not just sort of services that we like to use in our everyday life, but actually something as fundamental as how we do research.
Yeah.
So that's my first one. And the second one, I just can't not mention Crossrail. So we were really delighted to welcome Mark Wilde, the CEO who got Crossrail across the line, no pun intended, as our Hinton lecturer this year. And it is, it was at its peak Europe's largest infrastructure project. It has extraordinary complexity embedded in it, from how you have this precision tunnelling operation under our very complex foundations in London, through to the integration of all these different signalling systems. And I don't know about you, but I have certainly enjoyed riding up and down the Elizabeth line with my kids on many an occasion. And it's a fantastic user experience, truly beautiful stations, an extraordinary piece of engineering.
I have indeed, and it was a wonderful experience. I'm sure we're all going to enjoy it for many, many decades, probably centuries to come, given how London's tube network keeps creaking along. So that's a wonderful thing. Well, coming back to some more questions, but if you're just joining us now, we're talking about the engineering highlights of 2022. We've just heard from Alice about space-based solar power. That's her top pick, and how it's all going to be heating our homes via death ray microwaves in the not too distant future. Rachel was telling us about how the net zero challenge is really galvanizing action across all different disciplines in engineering, and well beyond that, of course. Steve highlighted the engineering marvel that is the North Sea link interconnector between Norway and the UK, fundamentally important in the current energy crisis we're facing. And you would maybe just caught Hayaatun there talking about a not so pessimistic view of the function of AI and how it's going to transform healthcare, and also what were you mentioning just literally a second ago? Crossrail, of course, which I forgot about in the 14 seconds I've been talking. But that's where we are. Again, if you've got questions, submit them via the Slido link. Let's stay with energy, Steve, because you started off on that path. There's never been a time, I think, more than now, when energy security has been more in our minds. But at the same time, coming at a time when we've never been more concerned about the net zero challenge as well. So I think what I want to explore first of all is, where does this leave us? Is the energy security challenge going to sort of help or hinder our efforts to tackle net zero?
Well, I am an optimist, without question, but actually I think with some justification, because I think it was a fear back in February when the war started that there'd be a massive shift in policy all of a sudden. And the right answer was net zero. Actually, this gives us the impetus to go even faster, for goodness sake. How do we wean ourselves off fossil fuel, first of all, carbon fuel, and international exposure to prices that are completely outside our control? And gratifyingly, that's pretty much what's happened. We haven't reversed. Now, you made a comment early on. As a result of needing to keep the lights on and keep our society working, then the UK, like many other countries, has had to revert to some old fuel sources in the short term. But from a direction point of view, it's given a real push. I think as Rachel was saying, real push into net zero. How do we do more and go faster? That's the good news piece, I think, for sure.
Is there a danger, though, in our rush to secure supply, that we actually make investments that are going to lock us in? I mean, this is one thing I have heard a concern about. If we exploit more offshore North Sea gas, if we open up more coal mines, if we secure long-term contracts with Qatar for LNG, are we going to sort of bed ourselves into fossil fuels? Is that a risk?
No, right. But it has brought that debate to the fore, which again I'm personally very pleased about, because I meet people all the time who are great fans of net zero and low carbon energy, etc. And anti-oil and gas, as you can see on the M25 every day at the moment. So let's get real about energy is quite important. It keeps our society going. It saves lives every single day. So we can't afford to not have energy. So a dialogue about understanding the transition, how we phase out fossil fuels as fast as we can, and replace them with zero carbon energy. I think that's just brought that debate to the fore. There's a lot more to do, obviously, for people to understand all the nuances of that debate. The other piece I just point to that I love is the way the electric system works in every country is, historically, we've always just supplied what people want. So it's a demand-led system. How do we make sure we've got enough capacity always for the half an hour every 20 years when demand's been the highest? When you think about that, that's a crazy way of running any business, isn't it, in a sense? And it needs to shift on its head, actually, which is exactly what it's doing, saying the wind is blowing enormously right now, we've got lots of solar power as well, and we've got surplus, as we do have in this country today, power. Please use it, it's free.
Yeah.
And that's now coming into the ether as well, that people are understanding as with some of the pricing mechanisms, and understanding the flexibility everyone's got as a consumer to take things when they're cheap and actually when they're really expensive to not use them. And that's a debate that's been going on for a long time amongst the technocrats in a sense. But that's the market of the 2030s that I think we're now seeing being brought into the 2020s. That's another good outcome from what's been going on in my view.
Okay. Alice, I'm curious to know, because a lot of this is very earth-based, ground-based, but I mean, what role does the space industry and the work that you're involved with keep an eye on net zero, assess how we're doing with it, measure our progress?
Yeah, it's really important, isn't it? It's kind of the old adage, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? And I completely agree with Rachel and with Steve that, it's really, really positive that we're getting more traction on the need for, verification of the true net zero operations of industry in particular, and we need that independently verified. So we're seeing not only for carbon dioxide, but in particular for methane emissions, we can now measure those emissions from space at the industrial facility level. Yeah. So you're getting that independent verification of exactly how environmentally friendly that business operations are. And that's really, really important to obviously the investor community, because they need that independent verification in order to be able to mobilize the ethical, sustainable finance that we're going to need. Because you talk about the transition away from fossil fuels. I mean, we're 80% dependent on fossil fuels today. It's huge, right? And any of those potential solutions are going to require an enormous scale up. So yes, that's an engineering challenge. We're talking about it as the greatest engineering challenge we've ever seen. But it's also a financial challenge. It's a regulation challenge. All the pieces of that system have to be in one place. And I do think that independent verification is going to be really, really important to get the private investor, the financial community at the table.
I was really struck by that when the Nord Stream pipeline got blown up a few months ago. It was a methane sensing satellite that actually I was using to calculate what's the amount of gas actually coming through that pipe. So there wasn't certainty, no one was really talking, yet we've now got the ability to see methane emissions at that really fine scale.
Yeah, at that granular
and get
level,
reasonably good estimates of what they are, which was totally new for me and was actually quite recent. Rachel, we were talking about this sort of the whole system when it comes to net zero. Is there more that we can do to encourage this across various sectors of the economy? I mean, I'm thinking particularly about in the built environment. I know we're going to come on to talk about that later in the COVID context, or at least that's my plan. But such a challenge there.
No, I think, it builds really neatly on what both Steve and Alice have said already. I think if we stand back from this and think about it in the context of, big strategic systems and how they all fit together and so on, there isn't a conflict between any of this stuff at all. The fact, as we've been saying, that there is this energy supply potential crisis in front of us is in fact making us all stop and think about, now hang on a minute, how can we get to a better set of answers faster? I guess I sort of find myself channeling my sort of inner mum at this point and say, we always have a choice around what the solutions are here. You always have a choice. There are very few reasons to make a bad choice, and right now we have no good reason to make bad choices on this front, really, because the only real reasons for deciding to go in a direction that wouldn't take us towards a more sustainable, renewables-based energy system would be those sorts of bad decisions that effectively take us backwards. But I think just to kind of add one extra piece, I guess, and I think to build really on what Steve was saying there, we all want, of course, a secure energy supply. Part of that, of course, as we were saying, it is that pure supply piece. The other really obvious thing that where it feels we've only really begun to scratch the surface is just to use less of it. And that applies at the personal level in each of our homes, but it also applies at the industrial level. It applies again across all of our sectors. There is so much we could do in terms of buildings and transport in particular around the UK, but also all other engineering related sectors all over the world. There is so much we could do to just make it easier to get to the point where we are genuinely less reliant on supplies of energy that are essentially outside our control and which are not based on clean technologies and so on. And I think for me, it's really handy that lines up exactly with the whole piece around the climate crisis as well. We've got everything to do with the attack side towards net zero, all the pieces around decarbonisation, all the things to do with climate mitigation, or the removal of carbon from all those systems. We want the same thing, but it's just about keeping in the short term, as these crisis points come, keeping that big long-term whole system goal in mind so that we just keep taking those steps in the right direction. Of course, it also helps on the defensive side of the climate crisis too, because if we have less of an issue to deal with because we've managed to limit temperature rise, to a better degree than perhaps we're doing at the moment. Degree is a terrible pun in that situation, sorry, apologies. But if we've actually managed to do some of the right things, we have less of a problem to get at in the future as well. It'll be cheaper, it'll be less risky. All these things start to fall into place. Logic suggests that we would be complete fools to take ourselves in any other direction right now, because these things are not optional. None of these crisis points, climate, biodiversity, social equity, etc., these are not optional crisis points. We can decide, shall we deal with them or shan't we? It's about, shall we deal with them now or shall we put it off? And in putting it off, we accept that the risk, cost, etc., goes up.
And the fact that you just said they're all interconnected.
Yes, exactly.
They're not one crisis.
Separate
You can't separate.
You can't separate.
So building on that, really, we're talking about a classic systems problem, if you like, and there, the engineering systems approach can be a really helpful way of making this more tractable from a policymaker's perspective. And I think we need to have some sympathy for the fact that, as a policymaker, the investment and the innovation timelines don't align brilliantly with political cycles, particularly at the moment, and the kind of the sense of which technology do I back when the pace of innovation is so fast can be quite an overwhelming place to be. So one of the things that all of you have been involved with is the National Engineering Policy Centre work that the Academy hosts to try to support policymakers in adopting a systems approach to net zero decision making. I think one of the really practical things that we've done recently is produce the low regrets framework, helping policymakers to think about what are decisions that they can take now that are probably going to look sensible under any circumstances. And so, that's some of the things we've talked about around investing in energy storage capacity, retrofitting buildings for insulation, and energy efficiency measures. And in that regard, I think it's really positive that we are now, I think there are plans in place for an energy efficiency task force and a national target for reducing energy consumption.
That brings us perfectly on to what I was going to go to next. And this is about who are the people who are going to do this? Now, there are so many challenges here, and I think a lot of them speak to the engineering profession of various forms that it takes. And we need the skills and we need those people in work, but I think also maybe some of the engineering literacy within policymaking, within government. The Prime Minister's spoken about how we need to develop skills. He's described education as the closest thing we have to a silver bullet for public policy to do this. What do we need to see? Do we need to see change to get more engineers, more people with these skills addressing this challenge? I mean, that's to all of you. Who wants to take it first?
Yes.
But how?
And there's some good news again in here. There's some good news. I mean, we've all been involved for many years in the promotion of engineering, as the Royal Academy does in a sense, and understanding the role that STEM education has to play in our school system, etc. And the stats have been improved enormously. We've got 50% more people wanting to do engineering degrees today than 10 years ago. We've gone for, I think it was 8-to-1 male to female to 5-to-1, still 5-to-1, but it's a step in the right direction. There's lots of good things going on there, but there's still an awful lot to do. So I'm involved with something called the Careers and Enterprise Company that works with the Royal Academy of Engineering and Engineering UK to help all the businesses who are working with schools to actually talk to kids about the sort of jobs that are there, etc. And to broaden, as you'll hear through the whole of this conversation, engineering, because people have such a narrow view occasionally, whereas understanding it sits behind everything in life. We're talking about AI, we're talking about everything.
Yeah.
So what are green jobs, for example? And of course, people, that's a wind farm, or is that a space station or something? Go, well, actually, no, if you get into what Rich was just saying, you get into our built-in environment, so many of those jobs actually about, it's just so much of what I would say people might perceive old engineering to be, that's all about the new low carbon sustainable future. And we've got, the good news is we've got a passionate generation who really care.
Well, this is going back to
really care. So the challenge is to inspire them and to put them in the right direction. So you really care about it. Some of the things that you think aren't associated with that absolutely are going to be at the heart of solving this problem. So science and engineering, we're going in the right direction. We just, like everything else, need to do more faster.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's what Steve said. And
Yeah.
oh, let's roll out some stats. It's about that time.
Good, yeah.
Love
Love stats.
So it is said by 2030, 85% of the jobs that we will do are unknown, right? And that's because of the pace of the technology change and the innovation that's to come. But it is also said that 80% of that workforce in 2030 is in the workplace today. So absolutely, it's the next generation. It's inspiring more kids to take up degrees, et cetera, et cetera. But it is also about lifelong learning. It's about upskilling, reskilling. It's why we have professional engineering institutions, everyone. Plug over. To provide those kind of constant learning opportunities. And you can see places of the UK, I mean, I'm thinking of sort of northeast of Scotland, where they've really shown that this is possible. You know, they've really gone to be best in class in terms of, you know, the thought leadership for you know, offshore wind, etc., taking the prior experience in oil and gas and reskilling. So there's some really, really positive examples to draw from, but we mustn't forget the existing workforce. It's absolutely important to inspire the next generation, but it's equally important that our workforce in place today is looking for those opportunities to constantly reskill, upskill.
Rachel, do you think we need to...
Go on, sorry.
No, I was just saying, do we need to do more? Do we need to change the way we do things?
I think I would just sort of turn that dial another notch on. I would suggest, and it's funny because I was saying similar to an event in the Houses of Parliament just last week, I think all engineering jobs going forward, pretty much from now, all of them are going to absolutely be reliant and totally bound in with this huge sustainability, properly defined social, environmental and economic side of things, challenge that we face. And I think that the biggest opportunity that we have now is to help those who are already here to understand the hooks between that huge message and what they actually do on an everyday basis, but also to inspire those future generations who are probably quite scared actually about the future that lies ahead for them. Try and inspire the fact that there is a lot of positive action they can take by joining in with communities like this. But I think the way we have to do that, and maybe I'll say a bit more about this in a moment, is we cannot carry on trying to attract people into engineering in the way we've always tried to attract people into engineering, because frankly, that's not going to work in the grand scheme of things, I would argue. An awful lot of us have got here by mistake. Yes, probably, I'm guessing, I have no stats, but I would guess maybe half in the grand scheme of things have found their way into these sorts of careers. How do we actually act like much more of an intentional magnet as opposed to a sort of an accidental, you know, path where people get here and go, oh, I had no idea. There's so much to go out in that space.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we might talk more about how we attract more people into engineering, but I mean, I think, you know, the bottom line is we will not be able to deliver the energy transition, or indeed to power our economy more broadly, unless we have, you know, the quantity, quality and diversity of engineering skills that are going to underpin that. And we're not in a position where I think any of us can be complacent that that's automatically going to happen. So in addition to the very well made points by my colleagues, I would also add that I think the profession as a whole, our community, needs to look inward and ask ourselves whether we are being as effective as we can be in both attracting that new generation, but also that the upskilling challenge that Alice mentioned. And in terms of a couple of asks from government, you know, actually, I think there is a role for having a more strategic view to articulating our skills needs into the future. That's a conversation between the profession, the private sector and government. So things like strategic labour force planning don't sound terribly exciting. But, you know, in the world we live in, where the pace of technology is changing very, very fast, where we've got a changing shape of the workforce, we've got massive global competition for talent, I think failure to do that is a very dangerous place to be. And then secondly, one of the great frustrations that I certainly experience is that we have this very early specialisation in the UK that means people are effectively ruling themselves in or out of careers at the age of 13 or 14. Now, how does that make sense for anybody? And also, don't we want people in all careers to have a broader, more balanced skill set going into those? So I'll get off my soapbox for now.
One quick
yeah, exactly.
Back to Alice's stat, because the 85% of jobs we don't know about today is also true. But the work also says that 65%, I think, need people who are STEM-based.
Yeah.
So we have to just be honest with people about, that's where I can't tell you what the job's going to be necessarily, but I can tell you that understanding is going to be part and parcel of where all the jobs are going to be. So let's make that really clear to people as early as we can.
I've let you talk far too much. We've got a lot more to cover, so we're gonna have to pick up the pace here. It's entirely my fault. I'm here to try and keep you in line. But there was just one other, well, there's a couple of other things, but a big standout thing from the year that we've just been through, and really the year before that, was the interface between COVID-19. We suddenly became aware of our environment in a way that we never had before, and particularly the built environment. How close we were to each other, how fresh our air was, whether we could ventilate our buildings. And there's sort of overlap there with the net zero challenge, as well as we're all switching off our radiators at home to try and save heat. And I never thought I'd be thinking about this, and suddenly I was interviewing, physicists who study the airflow in buildings, many of them, fellows of yours. Where to begin? I mean, do we need to think about this going forward? Is there a lesson learned from 2022? We need to think about the way we make buildings, we live in buildings, move forward.
Yes.
Right.
It's the simple answer. Absolutely, yes. I mean, this should have been our eureka moment, right? It should have been the moment when we realised just how critical air quality is for our health as water quality. I've been using the example that, kids in schools, they're drinking from the water fountain. We assume that water is safe. We're right to assume that water is safe. What we've seen in COVID is people occupying spaces which were really, really very far from safe. We did, just at the beginning of the year, actually, at the turn of the year, fantastic work with the NHS, because we had an NHS chief engineer within our membership, developing the standard where you could roll out UV sanitizers. So, the idea that UV is able to kill viruses has been long known. Discovered in 1847, in fact. But it was a really, really pacey piece of work to, do that modelling of the airflows, to understand exactly what capacity you needed, what flow rates you needed to make that environment clean. So, yes, I've come away from that thinking, brilliant, brilliant. You can roll them out in hospital wards, and sort of turn around to like the biggest faceplant moment when I'm watching my kids in all of their coats going into school with all the windows wide open at a time when, it's just a catastrophe for energy bills, a catastrophe for the environment. So, yes, we really should learn from this going forward.
What can we do? Have you got any ideas about how we need to make that happen? Is that something professional organisations have to do, or is it...
Well, can I help you out here, Tom?
Yeah,
Because the Academy, again, through the National Engineering Policy Centre with colleagues from IMechE and other organisations, SIBSE as well, in particular, did a report for the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance. In fact, we did 2 reports because it was so important, about how we can make our built environment more infection resilient. And we've got a whole set of recommendations in there that vary from the, having standards that people can work to make sure that you minimise the transmission of infection whilst at the same time meeting net zero goals, through to how you actually make sure that standards are then utilised in practice. So I won't go into detail, there's lots in there, but yeah, big topic. And while we're on the theme of healthcare, can I pick out another of my healthcare highlights, which is just, I think it has been a really great year for examples of engineering making a difference in people's lives in terms of health and well-being. And one of the things that was really filled me with joy was giving our McRobert Award, which is the UK's longest running award for engineering innovation, to a fantastic company called Quanta Dialysis Technologies. And brilliantly, they had been inspired by a fruit juice dispenser. This is engineering innovation in action, right? This is how it really works. They'd been inspired by a fruit juice dispenser to create a much more compact dialysis machine that meant that during COVID in particular, but more generally, patients had a lot more flexibility in terms of being able to do dialysis at home. So just a really practical example of how healthcare applications of engineering innovation can really make a difference.
Now, I really want to go to some questions from our audience. Before I do, obviously the other event that completely rocked our world and the British society at whole was the death of Her Majesty the Queen. Hayaatun, she was your CEO of the Queen Elizabeth Prize. What was her legacy for engineering in the UK? I know it was something she was very passionate about, and I think the family as a whole has always been passionate about, the royal family, that is.
Absolutely. Very profound is a short answer. And if you think about the arc of progress of engineering and technology in her extraordinary 70-year reign, we underwent many transformations in that period, and really Queen Elizabeth was a great champion for engineering technologies throughout that. She really embraced progress. She was there at the inauguration of so many iconic engineering projects.
I've seen the video of her throwing the switch on Calder Hall, the first civilian nuclear power station.
Absolutely. Diamond Light Source, Channel Tunnel, of course, Crossrail, one of her last public engagements. She was the first monarch to send an email. So it's fantastic that we're going to be able to continue to honour that legacy through the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. And we've already recognised engineering innovations that have shaped our world, from the internet and the World Wide Web through to energy efficient LED lighting, through to permanent magnets, which we probably don't notice but actually are vital for everything from electric vehicles to our mobile phones. And we're celebrating 10 years of the prize next year, so that's very special for us. And I can't not mention her husband, who of course was instrumental in the creation of the Academy. So the Duke of Edinburgh was a huge champion for our Academy, and we're delighted to continue that work with the fantastic support of his daughter, the Princess Royal.
Brilliant, amazing. Well, what a great moment to end up. You're going to have to put. I'm just going to pop some glasses on and take a question. Keep them coming, people. We've got a few here to look at. Now, I'm not really sure what this question means, so I hope you do. It's from Dr. Michelle Fiorini. How digital twins and digital transition in general will help reach net zero. I have twins of my own, but they're not digital. So if you want to pass, let me know. Anyone have a go?
Where do you want to start? I can start us off on that one. So I think what the question relates to is to what extent can we actually use digital equivalents of the physical world in order to predict how things might behave if we do this and if we do that and so on. Obviously, in order to make a good prediction of what might happen, you have to have a pretty decent digital model, i.e. twin, to think about sort of how that works. So it all starts at the beginning of something where you might be creating something, or you're creating a model of something that already exists, and then you're trying to understand how the real world might behave, or how you might fine-tune, if you like, the operation of the real world. So in terms of net zero, I mean, really, it goes back directly to some of the points I was making earlier on. There are so many ways that we can do much, much more to decarbonise across the entirety of what we all do as engineers. Literally everybody has a role to play. So while we may not all have access to a perfectly formed digital twin, sadly, actually there are more and more examples, some of which you'd immediately identify as a formal sort of a twin in a systems type sense, others where actually you can just start to use the right tool sets to start to think about, okay, what would happen if I did this? What would happen if I did that? And it means then you can predict ahead of time in terms of that investment, how best to invest to rapidly reduce carbon.
And I'm guessing, given the scale and speed at which some of these investments we're talking about making, it would be a very good if we could do that virtually.
Or big decisions about, are we going to do this or not? And if we do the thing, sometimes it's quite difficult to unwind that and do something completely different. So yes, to have the best possible shot at getting to the fastest possible change in the right direction towards decarbonisation, there is clearly a role to play. That said, obviously we should not wait for the perfect digital twins to exist for everything, because very often actually common sense will tell us the direction we need to go, and we can actually get quite a long way using, these sort of bits of equipment on tops of our heads in terms of thinking about actually, what we know the right answer feels like it should be, but it's a good tool.
Yeah, I'm just trying to add another angle, because they're absolutely right. And I suppose if you think, back in the day, when we did engineering, there was quite a lot of building prototypes. You'd have to try endless different models, and perhaps that wasn't such an issue because materials weren't scarce. Now we think a lot about critical materials, and we think a lot about the scarcity of those critical materials for any of these transitions that we need to make to renewable energy supply. So that's another way in which using a digital twin approach, you can cut down on some of those materials, which I think is going to be increasingly important. It's quite scary when you think about the scale of materials we need in some of these areas. Yeah,
fantastic. Can I move on? No.
I was just going to sort of down a tiny little build. The other sort of really clever thing you can then do, if you have a better understanding of what you've actually got in terms of materials and so on, in terms of the circularity of that and the circular economy side of things, because you know much more about the assets in front of you and the system in front of you, you can make better use of that. You can retain its value, you can reuse it, repurpose it, recycle it, whatever it might be, in all sorts of ways that we have never thought about. And again, that all helps in the right direction.
Amazing. Moving on, because I want to get as many questions as we can. I've got one from Dr. Laura Cohen, who I believe is one of your visiting professors at the University of Manchester. She wants to know, given the current economic challenges, the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, what should be the top policy change for government to underpin current UK manufacturing businesses, so helping the country lever maximum economic benefit from all these fantastic technologies you've just outlined? I think this gets the idea of we're quite good at solving some of these problems and maybe coming up with the ideas, less good about actually building the companies and certainly manufacturing companies to make a difference. Any thoughts from you on that? It's certainly something we've been interested in lately.
Happy to just kick off. I mean, I think, obviously we could spend several days talking about this, but I think if I was to sort of distill down what's the key essence of policy making in this area that will make the biggest difference, it's having something that may or may not be called an industrial strategy, but effectively fulfills that same function. And that means having some long-term continuity in terms of the commitments you're making. It means making some choices about what you're going to focus on and prioritise and what you're not going to try and focus and prioritise. And it involves a partnership between the public and private sector. So at its simplest level, I think those are the kinds of elements of policy making that we do need to make sure that we can pull through the fantastic strengths in research into the day-to-day reality that lots of manufacturing businesses are facing, and more broadly across the sorts of sectors that underpin even net zero and the energy transition. So I'll stop at that point. I mean, I could go on, but I'm sure others have
the same thing, that's all. Well, and we do have an industrial strategy, of course. The problem is the execution of that strategy, then turning what is a very high-level strategic document into some real plans. And we do have a fear, we were talking earlier, Hayaatun and I, about making some choices and backing winners, and governments say it's not our job to do that, etc. Actually, the strategy kind of implies that you are going to do that. We know we've got some real strengths in the UK. Bioscience, we were talking about earlier, is one of those, actually. So turning a strategy into some real actions. How can I be more supportive? And the big question there is, how can we make it transcend multiple governments as well?
Yeah.
So it's not a 2-year strategy, it's actually a 10, 15-year strategy.
Yeah.
Alice.
And I think within that, just to give another real specific, I think there's a really, really fundamentally important role for government as an anchor tenant to some of these new technologies and renewable technologies in the public sector, in the public buildings, in the education sector, in the healthcare sector, you name it. And that doesn't mean that the government has to pick up the lion's share of the funding necessarily, but they can play a really, really critical role. If they are backing those technologies, that gives confidence to the markets. And it sounds kind of shocking to say it when, we're in a cost of living crisis, but actually there is really quite a lot of money out there in rather, limited buckets, but there's really quite a lot of money out there. We don't have to use all the taxpayers' money on this, but a wise, selective use of taxpayers' money to give confidence to the markets to lever that private investment could be really impactful. It means taking choices.
Yeah, and kick-starting things.
Yeah.
And is it fair to say that I can't think of a better word for it, the political chaos of recent year or two, that has not helped, though, give the clarity and the sense of direction that a lot of industry has been looking for? Is that reasonable to say? I mean, I certainly have heard that as I'm out and about talking to people.
From my point of view, absolutely. I mean, it's this word, it's confidence and consistency, and because, how on earth can, the world of business at large, of all these big sort of industrial delivery partners who are part of these supply chains to make all these things happen, how can they possibly commit unless they have some confidence that the same policy is going to be in place, looking ahead a reasonable amount of time? A bit of, movement is inevitable, but not wholesale swings one to the other. That's unhelpful.
And our history's been good. I mean, we get more infrastructure investment in the UK than almost anywhere else in the world. That's because we've got stable, long-term regulatory structures and intentions. Be careful not to throw away the things we've already got to a certain extent. Although we're hinting at, there's probably a layer on top of that we're going to need right now to really start to actually kickstart some things.
And we do need to remember that there is a global competition for talent and investment. There are lots of places where collaboration is vital. Those things are not mutually exclusive, but we have to be worldly wise in recognising how other countries are seeking to attract investment in the kinds of technologies that are going to be transformational and the manufacturing capability that sits alongside that.
There's a really, if I may, just one
Yeah,
funny,
of course.
There's an amazing example in the US actually of how their launch sector just completely transformed. So everyone's heard of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, SpaceX, Blue Origin. Effectively what the US government did, and you can kind of roll your eyes a bit because if you look behind the orders, there's another slightly different financial story. However, what is uncontested is what they did is, put their check down as a customer for a capability that didn't yet exist, right? Reusable launch capability. And as a result of that, they've been incredibly successful in the last 10 years and really, really driven down the cost of launch and have leveraged a whole load of private finance. I don't think we're ever going to go quite that far
down that
but
model,
it is a really bold thing, to sign up for a capability that hasn't yet been invented. And it worked pretty well.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Let me move on to another one. Ian N. This brings us back to skills we were talking about before. Is higher education, teaching and learning behind the sustainability curve? I think this is speaking to, if I may interpret your question, Ian, are we educating sustainability well enough, skilling people before they enter the workforce?
No, because I sit on a piece of work that's actually already looking at how do we make sure that sustainability is embedded in so much of our higher education systems.
Yeah.
And I'm one of the unusual people on this little working group because most of the others are professors actually. So there's a recognition there that it's being taught, it's being embedded in some of our systems. But again, there's just a lot more to do, I think, to make sure it's, as Rachel went earlier, it's in the, as opposed to an add-on, it's central. There's so many of the themes that we're picking up earlier that need to be wired into it. This is exactly the way you think about all of your problems. You think about it from a net zero perspective, you think about them from a diversity perspective, protecting the environment, you think about it from a circularity point of view with materials. It's not an add-on.
Rachel.
I do agree, but I'm going to be a little bit more positive. I think there is a lot of really good change already bubbling out there within the education system because people can see that this is the thing we need. So one of the things that I guess I'm really quite proud of from my year as president of the Institution of Civil Engineers is that in that year, it predated me because it was started to happen beforehand, but we actually managed to get it through within my year. We have now made it basically impossible to study an accredited civil engineering degree and then come forward into the industry and go forward to chartership, for example, without ticking off proper mandated modules that include pieces to do with sustainability for exactly this reason, because we know that we need, and it'll take a few years to come through, but the students who started their courses from last year and onwards are all now sort of in that model of learning, if you like. Now, it's not only about the people on the degree courses. There are obviously lots of different ways to get through into the industry and so on. You can, the more junior apprenticeship routes as well as the degree apprenticeship routes, as well as people who come in from left field and decide they want to come into our industry and so on. There is a massive education exercise that's needed across everybody that's already here, as we were saying before, as Alice was saying, but also everybody who's coming in as well. But I think, and maybe just to pick up on one of the points I was making earlier, the way that we're going to go about, or the way we can most successfully go about helping people to see the importance of this message is actually, it's all about our visibility, our attractiveness, our relevance, and all of that plays to exactly what we're getting at here.
Yeah.
It is not about going out and talking about how wonderful our huge projects are anymore. Some people obviously will be switched on to that and it is exciting, but that's not the end of the story. For a lot of people coming into the industry now from various different places, they're attracted by the purpose of what we do, the fact that we see these world crisis points. Here are careers that you can come into where you can genuinely help to actually make an actual difference now.
Yeah.
And if we can't articulate that, if we can't talk about it as that problem solving for a real purpose, well, frankly, I don't know what we're doing here, if you see what I mean.
Well, of course. I very much hear what you're saying, but I kind of agree with partly with what Steve was saying. This is looking at totally the other end of the telescope, back at the primary sector where my kids are right now. I'm quite surprised how sustainability environment are a topic still, and they're not throughout the curriculum. And I think, given what we were saying earlier, every job in the future is going to be a green job in one way or another. Why it's not sort of more embedded, given where these kids are going to be when they leave school,
and how we standardise.
In doing so, might prime more of them for going into these sorts of careers at an earlier age if they get passionate for it.
Tom, if I may, I just
I'm
want to say
panel,
to broaden that out, because I think that actually, there is a sort of slightly new model of what engineering leadership looks like. So alongside sustainability, I would put inclusion and ethics within that. And I think that, the best offers in terms of higher education and also further education have embraced that. But I don't think that it's an even picture yet. And I think within the profession, we're also still maturing in that regard. So we haven't talked so much about some of the digital dimensions of this. But if you think about the extent to which we're training people who are going to be digital engineers, all engineers are going to be digital engineers, but people who are going to have incredibly important roles in designing the data that forms part of our critical national infrastructure, are we supporting them in understanding how you embed engineering values around safety and reliability and equity of benefit into those systems? So as we are for the kind of the classic physical assets. So I think that there are a set of emerging aspects of engineering leadership that we're all across. We're working on this, but we've got further to go.
Sure. Handbrake turn now, and I'm glad this question came up because it's something I wanted to discuss. Hydrogen, it's bandied around a lot, and this is an anonymous question. It could have come from me actually, because it's sort of what I wanted to ask. It's very much in the media. What are the next steps, reads this question, to building a hydrogen economy in the UK? Do you think we're quite there yet?
Well, we talked earlier about...
I'm looking at you, Steve, because of your grid hat,
I'll start.
This is up to everyone, of course.
I mean, we talked earlier about the cross engineering disciplines that have been working on some advice for government on net zero, and I'm part of that, and we did issue a paper on hydrogen. Right? We did, and it's quite hard, these papers, because you've got lots of 30 people always slightly different views as well, and how to make sure that when you write it, it's not bland, but it can't cover all the views here. And I think the headlines of the hydrogen paper were that it's an important energy vector. That's a new buzzword for 2022. It's an energy vector, not necessarily a fuel. And we identified, as governments start to think about this, some of the questions that they need to be addressing. First of all, that it needs to be low carbon hydrogen.
Yeah.
And if you make hydrogen today in Poland with an electrolyser, you've got 3 times as much carbon coming out of the back end of that as you would if you're burning coal. So that doesn't make any sense at all when you look at this. So it's got to be low carbon hydrogen, essentially from renewable energy. So, and there's some work going on in the EU actually about actually defining what that means, which is, I think, very important to start with. But in terms of its uses, we certainly identified to look at steel making, heavy industrial uses where there's not an obvious net zero fuel alternative there. Energy storage, not short-term storage like batteries, but longer-term storage. Yep. In the electric system, that's a second one, and possibly a fuel for aviation and for shipping. Maybe off-road vehicles. So we kind of identified these are the areas that it makes some sense today. And it was trying to persuade, and I'm very passionate about this personally actually, be careful what you're articulating, what the narrative is here. Because you meet people all the time, they think, so hydrogen is the future. You go, no. In fact, Toyota announced this week their 6 new electric cars. They've been a big proponent of hydrogen as part of the road vehicle thing. They've clearly now realised that that's the wrong answer, actually, and they're going to go EVs. And you meet people all the time and think, well, is it going to heat my home? Unlikely.
Yeah.
I don't think, because you can use electricity, actually, which is probably going to be an easier answer. So it's definitely, in my personal view, and I think the view of the worker, it's got a real part to play in the energy mix of the future. But let's be careful that we're not talking it up, that actually it's...
And brings us very much back to the points you were making earlier about needing to see these things in the round, in the whole, how they're going to fit into the system,
and let's
systems
just
approach.
Get mature about it's not black and white, it's not this versus that, it's part of the system of the future.
I mean, exactly that. I'm giggling because it was described by a no longer minister as the silver bullet for all our future energy needs. And I think, that kind of black and white, all or nothing kind of analogy doesn't really work. It did get the withering response from our membership that this could only be... we shouldn't waste any more time talking about, for instance, domestic heating and hydrogens, as the well-known laws of thermodynamics already determine the answer. So we have to be careful, I think.
And you need to educate us journalists who happily ran out to film all those hydrogen-powered boilers and talk about how they were going to transform us before really thinking about the physics of hydrogen and how it moves around.
And that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because actually what gets airtime, if you like, actually isn't always logically in the sort of sequence that we've just been hearing about.
Shocking.
Exactly, but it doesn't help in terms of that wider education piece.
And I would put my hands up here,
misleading.
systems aren't very good TV, unfortunately. Systems,
though.
approaches and infrastructure, those things are quite difficult to bring to life. So it's about things often, and to try and keep that, that's a problem for my industry to start to think about as we confront this
Volunteer
as well.
to help. If you want to make systems exciting, we're here for you.
You got me here. I'm all ears. I'm literally-
Otherwise, just come back to space-based.
Look, we've run out of time to take any more questions from our audience, but I did want to, before we go, I want to look forward. We've looked back at 2022 with, I think, quite a lot of optimism, actually. I don't think it's been too pessimistic at all, but now's an opportunity to look forward. Can I get from each of you a sort of top pick for 2023? With that engineering perspective, starting with you, Hayaatun.
Thank you. Well, you've heard me talk with great passion and enthusiasm about some of the innovation that we've seen in healthcare. And what I would love to see, and I hope we will see in 2023, is that kind of creativity, the pace and the ambition actually in innovation in healthcare and life sciences being applied to some sectors and application areas which have had a bit less attention. So we talked about construction, decarbonising construction. There's a huge opportunity here. Built environment accounts for something like up to 40% of global carbon dioxide emissions, as well as thinking about water footprint and biodiversity and all the rest of it. So I would love to see us bring that spirit of really hungry innovation into the challenge of decarbonising construction and the wider sustainability challenge around that.
Fantastic. Steve?
I completely agree. I mean, because we talk about the climate being an emergency. Well, COVID was an emergency, and and look what we managed to achieve. It's unbelievable. Well, the climate's an emergency as well. So let's just change the pace of everything. And I would pick small nuclear reactors.
Okay.
I think it's a huge part of our future. Huge part. We're going to zero carbon energy. And we've got some great sites in the UK that are all ready for them. I'd like to see that. It's part of the plan at the moment. But
It is a bit. I mean, but do you,
it's so far down the road. Let's bring some real urgency to it in 2023.
so you think we'd need to see a bit more from government from that to
do.
get some good? That's a news line for me. Alice?
Fabulous. I've just been sat here changing my mind. Have
we left you anything to talk about?
But, well, I just think I'm going to build on Hayaatun's point because I think it is really, really important. We demonstrated, I'm not going to make a virtue of COVID in any way, but there were some tremendous engineering outputs during that period. We were talking about one the other day, and I always get this wrong. It's CPAP, which is continuous positive
air pressure.
Yeah. And that was, some engineers looking at the telly, Tim Baker and Becky Shipley, I'll give them a shout out, looking at the telly, hearing about the ventilator challenge and going, well, I get there's a challenge that people are struggling to breathe, but, why do we go straight to a solution of ventilators? That can't be right. And within 100 hours, they developed the first prototype, working with the Mercedes team. They knew very well, because they knew that Formula One wasn't happening, so they were sitting around not doing anything, and they'd be very happy to help. In 10 days got those approvals, and in 4 weeks got 10,000 devices. It's an extraordinary engineering challenge. So we must somehow keep the urgency without the crisis, and that can only apply, it doesn't apply anywhere better than on the climate.
What an uplifting thought. Rachel?
We're all violently agreeing here. This is where I wish I'd gone first. No, I completely agree. I was also going to say something around its acceleration of the pace of change across all these different things we've been talking about, but in the right direction, and recognising that any step where we either stand still or where we allow ourselves just to slip backwards a bit means that we are absolutely going backwards in terms of the things that then lie ahead. I think everything we've just heard there, I mean, it just all fits together, doesn't it, really? It's just how on earth do we catch some of that feeling of urgency and say, right, this is actually probably even more urgent. It is another genuinely existential type crisis. Why on earth can we not wrap our brains around that? And I think as professionals, as engineers, that has to be a responsibility that we then take forward and just keep on pushing and pushing till everybody is thoroughly sick and tired of hearing us talk about it.
And one tiny further note of optimism, because I had meant to mention this, I think it was just yesterday that the annual Ipsos Mori poll came out of the most trusted professions. Engineers were number 2. Amazing, yeah. Second only to nurses, and there's absolutely no shame in losing out to nurses.
Not. Please don't tell. I was about to say, I'd be be surprised if we made the top 20.
Yeah, but that trust is really important, right? Because
absolutely.
all the stuff we're talking about here involves taking risk, involves taking bold decisions. So
See, that's great. That's great
a
news.
really
And how much of that goes
optimistic
back
note.
to some of the points we've been talking about that have occurred during 2022? I
Yeah.
suspect quite a lot.
What a great note to end on, because unfortunately we are very much out of time. But look, can I thank all of you so much for joining us. It's been a really, really thought-provoking discussion, fascinating stuff. Rachel, Alice, Steve, Hayaatun, thank you very much indeed. Thank you also to the Academy for hosting this event, and to, of course, all of you, the audience. I hope we got some of your questions in there. Excellent questions they were indeed. If you're still watching online, fill out the brief online feedback form in the link in the YouTube chat under the video. The feedback will be very welcome for the team that organise these events to improve them for the future. Thank you very much for joining us all, and thank you again to our panel. Good night.
When you go into space and you then look back at this little blue jewel beneath you, it does make you want to look after the planet.
Engineers build the world. Engineers solve the question of how do we exist on this planet?
Climate change, ending poverty, all of the injustice that we see in the world now, engineering is key to solving those issues.
I mean, the world would be incredibly different without engineers.
Without engineers in racing, we crash.
There is not a thing, not one thing, that an engineer did not touch, and almost surely perfected.
They have that drive to actually use their skills to make the world a better place.
Do you prefer being in the audience, on the stands cheering for people, or do you want to be on the field playing the game?
George Bush called me, Bill Clinton called me, and I'm like, wow.
It was almost like being a kid in a candy shop.
I was going 240 miles an hour with walls and wheels around me.
The culmination of all my hopes and dreams.
There's a crying demand for engineering skills.
I think that anybody can be an engineer.
It was the best decision I ever made.